So, close observers and attendants and listeners of the sorting piece that I did yesterday, which involved sorting art books or picture books, or sometimes these volumes are referred to as coffee table books, into those volumes that I had acquired at a retail outlet run by the ARC program in Farmington, New Mexico, and those picture books which I had not acquired from that same retail venue. Close readers of that particular sorting project will have observed that this volume, North American Birds, I sorted incorrectly, and the sorting of this volume incorrectly brings me, to a number of different considerations around that result and that misplacement, which isn't exactly a displacement, but misplacements are also interesting for a number of reasons. So the first issue that it raises is whether this volume was misplaced into the ARC books intentionally or unintentionally. And if it was intentionally, it was obviously on the part of the creating subject or the performer to to mark this book or to call attention to it in some way. And if it was unintentional, then it raises other questions. Viewers and followers of my work will remember that I'm not particularly identified with Freud as a kind of devotee or follower of a particular set of beliefs and attitudes that belong to Freud's particular way of articulating the relationships between consciousness, unconsciousness, subconscious, and the articulation of subjects that arrive or result from dynamic relationships between the mechanisms of suppression and integration as he formulates them, and the reasons readers of my work will also recall are largely social political. That I have a tendency to look at things from the perspective of the way that social structures and hierarchies inherent to cultures and institutions formulate the social relationships that exist in our interactions and in encounters with ourselves and others in the world. But I do think that certain aspects of Freudian thought are significant and useful. And one of those aspects or an area in which I seem to concur with Freud is that mistakes and errors are never simply mistakes and errors, and often the mistakes or slips, we refer to Freudian slips, are in many ways more interesting than more interesting from a psychological point of view than those areas in which we get everything right. And I guess I was also interested in this mistake or this missorting in relationship to a discussion of poetry and the reading of poetry that I observed recently, and the formulation of reading of poetry and the articulation of this particular pedagogical sample was formulated in a statement or a question. What can we do if we think our reading of a poem is wrong? And what interested me about the question was the word wrong and the implied binary that it sets up. Is the opposite term, right? The complement term would be right, so that one's reading of a poem would either be right or wrong, in the same way that a sorting of volumes would either be right or wrong. And then the problem for me that right or wrong raises in sorting is, of course, like the whole problem of sorting to begin with. Is this one part of us or not part of us? Is this us or them? Is this normal or abnormal? And all of those sortings, very much bear upon the sorting that we performed yesterday, and the stories and anecdotes that I had discussed while I was doing that sorting. Now, the interesting thing about this sorting, or one of the many interesting things about this sorting, is that this volume, rather than coming from ARC, comes from my mother's library, but she acquired it from my grandmother's library after my grandmother passed away. And then this is also interesting. The sort of notice of ownership here that is given in such stylized form, right? This was obviously a sticker, and she had them printed, or maybe this was done on a computer with her name on it. This was probably, although this is I know that my grandmother possessed this volume for a considerable amount of time, and I'll explain how I know that in the story of this volume. But this type of sticker, I don't think would have been available to her until much later, and she probably didn't produce it because she didn't really use this kind of technology. So this was probably produced for her either by a grandchild, one of my cousins, or perhaps daughter-in-law, my aunt, or someone else, and added to the volume much later. But it wasn't in the volume as I remember it as a child, and I'll talk about that memory a bit. First, I want to talk about this newspaper clipping from 2010, and some of the reasons, perhaps, if we assume that this sorting that the artist performed yesterday, this missorting was not intentional and was in fact a mistake, why it might have occurred, and this newspaper clipping inside the volume explains part of that. Now, what this image reminds me of a bit, since we had been talking about art as it's presented in art books, is it reminds me of a Magritte painting, the title of which is The Threatened Assassin. And And The Threatened Assassin, it's an interesting title because assassin is an interesting word to use for the protagonist in this image. The image is of a man dressed in evening clothes, elegant evening clothes. And he's casually, I don't remember if he's smoking, but he's casually listening to music. And there's a gramophone playing a record, and he's just casually listening to this music. But the body of a woman appears in the image in the foreground, and although he seems to be ignoring it in a rather psychopathic manner of unconcern, and the body is there's blood displayed in the image, and this woman seems to have met her demise in an act of violence that is shockingly unobserved or unregistered by the calm of the man listening to the gramophone record. And the reason that I say assassin is an unusual term, and maybe I'm misremembering the title, but I believe it's the Threatened Assassin. But maybe I'm misremembering the title. But it's an odd word because the man doesn't appear to be an assassin, but rather a psychopathic killer, criminal. And outside of this room in which he's listening to this gramophone and lacking, and demonstrably lacking concern for the fate of this woman, there are individuals who appear to be hunting him or tracking him, and they have things like nets, and I don't know if they have spyglasses or things, but that's why he's threatened, because he's about to be captured. And oddly, and I'm sure that Magritte was well aware of it. Oddly, somehow the framing and the positioning of the threatening assassins, or rather the threatening capturers, put the reader or the observer, the subject of the experience of this representation in the position of feeling threatened along with this misnominalized assassin. And I always thought that was powerfully interesting from a psychological point of view, how that works. And of course this shifting identification positions is part of the way that cinema works, and Magritte seemed to have insight into that. And I don't know whether that was because he had observed it in cinema, or became aware of it as simply as a painter, and some of the ways that painting positions the viewing subject in similar ways in terms of scopophilias and exhibitionisms. And so the curiosity of those identifications in both positionalities in viewing visual art and in cinema seem to be present here as well. And I suppose it's possible to identify with the stalkers in this particular image, but I of course identify powerfully with the blue heron, and the title stalking a masterpiece again, is significant to what we were looking at yesterday, right? With these volumes of masterpieces and the way that works of art, get sorted into what belongs to the realm of masterpiece and what belongs to the realm of picture book or, children's illustrated story. And stalking is, itself an interesting word. One of my favorite films by Tarkovsky is called Stalker. He's the stalker of the zone. And the zone is a powerful metaphor of, both, the indefinable outside and the indefinable internal, unconscious, outside. And then if you take off, the S, of course you have talking, and if you remove the K and you reorganize the letters, you have lasting, and if you reorganize the letters and merely separate the L and the K as a word boundary, you have last king, and there's just really a lot going on with this image. And before I move on, the story itself, has to do with collections, and one of the types of work that I have been doing across the decades involves collections, right? Whether those are collections of stones or collections of books or other types of collections, and then working with those collections and exploring them in terms of the way that they define human space, time, and relationships in social hierarchies and economies and other aspects of our lives that are hardly neutral and are never transparent, right? That always are embedded in networks and structures of power, and so the article is interesting in a number of reasons, and references original copies of Audubon, Birds of America, which is related, to this volume, because this, also is, and I imagine this clipping is because of the date, again, the clipping itself. Raises again this question of is this or is this not? I'm not entirely sure when my mother acquired this volume, so I don't know if she is responsible for clipping this particular section and putting it in the volume, or whether an uncle of mine or an aunt or someone else might have added it much later. But you'll see that though the volume referred to Audubon, this is not a book by Audubon, and in that, also one has to raise the question: This is not. Was this a mistake, a misrecognition of this volume as a volume of Audubon books, or was it an intentional, gesture of irony and mystery? The solving of the relationship, putting it into a context of dislocation or a rhetorical relationship that draws upon the idea of how these sort of nature drawings, right? These classificatory drawings of birds that one thinks of as scientific descriptions could have ever been designated as masterpieces, because masterpiece, as we know it, is not typically used as a word to designate drawings of birds, whether North American or otherwise, for descriptive and illustrative purposes of identification, right? So these paintings by Marie Nonest Bolin were either misrecognized as Audubon's, by whoever it could have been my mother. I don't believe that it was my grandmother, because the date, here, if this is in fact the proper date, gets a bit in the way. So Audubon enters into the history of art in an interesting way and becomes unique in a certain sense. Not entirely unique. There are other examples in which this kind of scientific drawing and this kind of illustrative drawing gains, great, status. And one of the reasons, is the historical, periodicity in which, Audubon did his work, and then, how the work was collected, the history of it as object, and its transmission, as volume into the art world, and names like. This one and others, right? This arena of exchange, is largely the arena in which objects like this gain, lose, and transform in value, right? And if you look at some of the other images in this particular clipping, you'll see that it's all about value. Now, the relationship between this volume and this clipping is already interesting, but then it becomes even more interesting if you learn a little bit about my grandmother's history with this volume, and what my mother might have considered a masterpiece of my grandmother's work, or merely wish to rhetorically reference in some way. But the volume, let's see if I can find an example of the image, was used by my grandmother. Oh, there we go. Okay, so that's my handwriting from childhood. So she asked us to, my grandmother asked the grandchildren and her children, my mother and my uncle and my uncle's family, my cousins, and my grandfather, to all of us to identify our favorite birds. And I don't remember if she gave us a limited inventory. You can identify this many, or if she just, said, identify some of your favorite birds. And so that was one of mine, and I put my name by it. I think there are 3 or perhaps more birds that I identified. I'm going to look and see if I can find any other birds that others identified as their favorites. Not seeing any other names here. Well, they're seeing... I guess I identified a lot because that's another one with my name. I'm actually not looking for my name, I'm looking for others. Maybe I'm the only one that didn't follow the rules. Maybe that would be very likely. She might have asked us to identify one bird that we liked, and I identified several. And no, I thought this was one. I thought I had recalled that someone had marked this, but I don't see a name here. So maybe I'm mistaken. It's a hummingbird. Owls. I wasn't aware of my relationship to owls at that time. There's another one with my name, and I'm still not finding anyone else's. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here's Tom. So Tom Paczkowski, Thomas Paczkowski is my cousin. He lives and works in Portland now, or did the last time that I that I was aware. And he had been working for Greenpeace, but he in Portland he was doing work. What is the word? Reclaiming wood from old buildings and to be recycled and reused, so that instead of chopping down trees to serve as lumber for the construction of housing purposes, right? So good work. So this one was one of Tom's. But clearly, okay, this is Mom. So that's my mother. She would have, really like to find some other names, but clearly already in this volume I've unintentionally singled myself out, right? Because I seem to have either misunderstood the game or ignored the rules, and that's very much like me. So that's interesting in and of itself. But I seem to be the only one that identified, multiple birds rather than one bird. And we still haven't even gotten to the bird that my grandmother actually chose that I identified to. Oh, here's another one that I'm absolutely positive. Oh yeah, there it is. That's my grandfather. That's Huey. So that's Hubert Paczkowski, and that's the bird that he chose. The red-bellied woodpecker. All right, well that's enough, but oh, here's one. And that's Willie, that's Wilhelmina, my aunt, my that's enough, because I can't find the one that I had chosen that my grandmother actually used, but I'll explain what she used it in. So, but before we move on to all of that, I had promised that I would say something about Billy Graham. Okay, so this one. This is December 1989. Considerably earlier, and obviously, this particular magazine, did belong to my grandmother, and for some reason she placed this in this volume, or someone placed this in this volume, and they were Mennonites, and interested in this kind of Christian evangelical project, and one of the reasons why I never became confirmed as a Mennonite is because I wasn't interested in this kind of project, although I appreciated some of the work that I was a child, almost making the Black Lives Matter sign. I did appreciate some of the work that they did in the MCC Mennonite Community Center, and we'll talk more about that later. But right now, really, interesting. What is this from? I don't recognize. Oh, these are poems, I guess. No wonder I don't recognize them. One of the reasons that I'm looking at this and talking about my missorting is because I think one of the explanations for my missorting. Oh, here's some image of bird. I don't know if this image of the bird was enough to place this volume in. Maybe it was some kind of magical thinking, like that the image of the bird and this narrative somehow belonged to my grandmother's project. I don't really know. Sometimes people refer to these as loose connections. My grandmother was interesting, though, because even though we had completely different ideologies, she did have a way of reading signs and moments in space-time that reminds me very much of my explorations as a reader of signs and space-time traveler. I just think that she got it wrong, but talking about some of the reasons for the missorting, or why I did it wrong, belong to the fact that it was towards the end of the sorting, and I was running out of space to create my arc. So there were multiple things going on. I was talking, I was analyzing, and I was looking at these materials and trying to relate the materials to the discussion in interesting and in relevant ways, right? Bringing the events of this moment in space-time and the materials appearing in front of me to other moments in the stories, and do the sorting, and I had gotten in the habit of finding articles like this, of assuming that they belonged to volumes that I had acquired in ARC, because a lot of the volumes that I had acquired in ARC had clippings like this, and I hadn't, or if I had seen this, the name hadn't registered to me, and it wouldn't have registered to me that my grandmother would have had a sticker like this, because, like I said, the sticker must have been applied much later. And there's another story about of these kind of labels of ownership that belongs to an entirely different set of numeral significances and performative mathematics that skirts an avant-garde, group referred to as neoism, and certain kind of relationship that I had of observing art communities at a particular time, and of skirting again these margins of observation and capture, the apparatus of capture and observation, and of documentation of activity, that belong to not so much to the semantic field of stalking, but of perhaps of say spying, so more this network than this network, but this network here, very very much so. So that's an interesting collision, there as well. But I, in the process of sorting these things, I had gotten kind of in the habit of seeing a clipping and throwing it into the arc pile, and that was a mistake. If it were indeed a mistake and I hadn't intentionally missorted it, and so right now in this narration, my subjectivity is playing itself out as being unaware of my subjectivity in that moment. And I think that that's particularly useful for a number of different ways. And in space-time travel, this is always an issue, because whatever we remember doing or believe that we did is always questionable, because we're never really the same in this moment as we were in the moments that preceded. And that's psychological sophistication. That's just understanding that your memory, whatever you believe, that your memory tells you, it's in part, a creation of who you want to be, and what you suppress in yourself because of what you don't want to be, and in that way, again, it relates to Freud and some intersections that my thought and Freudian thought, still maintain. But this is, one of the explanations for why I was sorting. As I mentioned, was towards the end of the sorting process, and I was running out of room. So I was running out of space in this process that I was engaging in, time and space. And I was sorting quickly towards the end, and trying to wrap things up, because in addition to sorting in space and running out of space and running out of time, because I had just exceeded the hour, that I like to limit these pieces to just for the purpose of getting them up on YouTube because of my slow internet. So in addition to running out of space, running out of time, and having gotten in the habit of sorting this way by the finding of clippings automatically going into the arc. In addition to all of that, I would have misrecognized this sticker as being out of time, right? In the same way that this clipping would have not belonged to my grandmother's life, being out of time, if I had observed the date. And I would have, assumed, trying to put it in time, in a way that wasn't anachronistic, that the clipping, must have belonged to someone else's configuration of this work. So, all of that being said, I still haven't explained, the idea of masterpiece, and why there are names of my family members next to all of these birds. And the reason, for that is that my grandmother used images of these birds, in her quilting, and she did needlepoint. So the birds that we identified for each of us, she did a needlepoint imitation of, which again is not the kind of work that one considers a masterpiece, right? Masterpieces are original works of art, original drawings, not copies, not tracings, not needlepoint versions of others' work. Grandma Moses started out as a needlepointist as well, and then when her abilities, her dexterity diminished to the point where she couldn't do that, then that's when she became a painter, right? Not later, but in this instance, my grandmother appropriated these images that we had chosen, and then she did the needlepoint work, and then she took these and then she put them all together in a rather large quilt, organized the individual pieces, and put them together in a large quilt. And then so it's really an amazing piece of folk art that she produced. And then, as I had mentioned before, there's the Mennonite. MCC doesn't mean Mennonite Community Center. It means Mennonite Community something. I can't recall now, but it's basically an organization that devotes resources to certain causes. So if there's a famine somewhere, they send individuals in that area food. And I always admired this part of their belief, that it was very much about like helping people with needs in the world, no matter where or who they were. And in that sense, a very globalist idea. And of course, they weren't they weren't really evangelical in the sense that in spite of the liking of individuals like Billy Graham, they weren't really evangelical in that same way. The needs were largely that they met were largely material, and had to do with clean water, housing, food, basic health needs. I remember buying a package and sending somewhere, either somewhere to in India or perhaps the African continent. I'm not sure, but I remember as a child like putting together a package, and you would buy these materials, and then you would send it as a Mennonite care package. And anyway, it had things like soap and different kinds of food, and I don't remember what else, toothbrush maybe, useful items. and I always liked that. So it was other aspects of the community that I had problems with, and again, the conservative social dimensions of politics and misunderstanding of history, but in any case, my grandmother, when she completed this quilt, donated it to the MCC, and then there was an auction, and sold, she was going to sell it there. But my grandfather, couldn't couldn't bear parting with this masterpiece, right? So he actually, she donated to the MCC, and then he actually bid on it, and and purchased it. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, and then they had it for a while, and I don't know what happened to it after my grandmother passed away. If my mother acquired it, or if my uncle acquired it, or someone else acquired it, or if it was redonated to the MCC. But apparently, obviously, but though my mother acquired the volume of illustrations that the images in the quilt, were based upon and modeled from, and So, that whole story, perhaps, revealed something about, if this was a clipping that my mother added, reveals something about why the humor involved in this particular selection, and whether the quilt, whether the blue heron is the quilt and the stalkers are those seeking the quilt, in her reading, or whether the quilt is, I don't know, maybe the quilt doesn't appear in this image, but maybe something else, maybe this volume itself, is misread as the blue heron, and the stalkers of the volume are those interpreting it. Maybe I'm one of these individuals with the butterfly nets, and kind of amusing that they're stalking a blue heron with a butterfly net, I think, but or maybe that's a fishing net, I'm not sure, but they look like butterfly nets to me. But I don't know netting that well that I could entirely make a definitive claim about what type of nets those are. But it's amusing in any case, and maybe I'm this guy, and the blue heron is the narrative itself, or maybe the blue heron is the relationship between this article, the image, and the story, and the volume, and we're all these individuals trying to piece together the relationship. In any case, this brings me back to, again, this question of what do you do if you think your reading of a poem is wrong, and I guess what I'm doing right now is one thing to do, right? Is to describe, because being right or wrong, it seems to me, is the wrong question or the wrong formulation. The question is, what do we make of the blue heron? And if the blue heron, is sorted as a story, the results of our interpretation are different than if the blue heron is sorted as a volume of Audubons. If the blue heron is sorted as a misunderstanding of a volume of Audubon's, it's still a different question, and there are multiple ways of being wrong. The multiple ways of being wrong are more interesting to me than the one way of being right, because it's not a crossword puzzle. There's not one solution for every line. There are multiple solutions for each line, right? So the blue heron could be the difference between, perhaps, Audubon and Marie Nonest Bowen. The blue heron could be the difference between the story that I tell about my grandmother's quilt and its history, and the way that and the actual quilt and its history. It could be the distinction between my memory and someone else's memory of the events, or it could be just a symbol of something blue, or it could be the singular bird that I was supposed to choose when everybody else chose a singular bird, and I chose, who knows, that there were at least six I think that we identified, and we just made a cursory study of inscriptions in the volume. So I may have identified a dozen or more, and that in itself, could be defined as wrong, right? But to me, it's more interesting to define it as something else, not as something wrong, but as something worth looking at, something worth investigating. In that sense, being like Freud's identification of those slips, being more interesting in a certain way than getting it right. Do these people know that this is a blue heron? In fact, blue herons aren't this blue. I'm assuming that the stylization of the blue is just to identify it as a blue heron. I'm actually familiar with blue herons from the mission that I talked about yesterday, Mission San Luis Rey, in which, as I mentioned yesterday, we used to have the powwows in the summertime, and I used to prepare the ground for those, and there were a lot of blue herons that used to come down. And the reason that they came down to that particular mission was because there were gophers in the grass, and the herons would stay. They would stand on one leg, and they would be very, very still and quiet. And then when a gopher would come, within their compass and range, they would very quickly snatch up the gopher. And this might surprise some people that these birds, eat gophers, but in fact they do. And I remember that there were many tourists to this mission that would be going about the mission and taking their pictures, and they would often, to my amusement, miss the great blue herons so close to where they were standing, and they simply didn't see them because they were so very still. And I guess that stillness and that ability to dissolve and become nearly invisible in one's environment, wasn't something that the artist or the illustrator of this particular image understood from experience about these amazing birds. So that's enough on that. And then perhaps the other reason for the missorting, whether intentional or accidental, is that Lori, my wife, is currently a teacher here in Fort Defiance, and she's doing a project that involves a kind of quilting, and this volume relating to my grandmother's quilting seems to point and indicate in that direction. So what I'm going to do, after wrapping this up, is ask her if she'll discuss that project, which also relates to the teaching of art in different contexts other than art school, per se, and the creation of masterpieces as one would find in a museum, but art, for purposes of social learning and project making and integrated material learning projects that I think is relevant, to the entire discussion and sorting project that we did yesterday as well, and in some ways much more relevant to it than the narration of the history of this volume of illustrations of birds.